This is Paul Schneiderman on Sports and Stuff. We're on Rainier Avenue Radio. This is a second edition of my show. And on this show, Sports and Stuff, we're going to be hitting on the legal, business, political, sociological, and cultural issues of sports. Today, as my second guest, we have Seattle native, current Seattle resident, former Major League Baseball player, Garfield High School graduate, Central Washington University graduate, and current financial planner, Bill North. I have happened to know Bill for several years in the center of the universe, Seattle's Leschi neighborhood, and I've always enjoyed Bill's insights on sports, baseball, and all sorts of subjects. And I'm going to get Bill on board here for a second, but as part of this introduction, I want to share that as a young kid growing up in Northeast Seattle, I was a baseball card collector, and I would put a lot of the Seattle baseball cards on a little special column. Bill North, Ron Santo, other Washington State players like Ron Cey. So it's just amazing, the time machine, Bill. Here it is in 2017. I'm interviewing you on this show. And as a little kid, I used to look at your baseball cards and collect them. So it's fun to have you on. I want to read this to Bill and the listeners a little bit more about Bill North. I got this from the Society of American Baseball Research online, written by a guy named Tim Ehrlich. And I want to read Bill what he writes about you here. And I know you were played on 4 playoff teams. You had a couple World Series championship rings. Well, let me read this sentence about Bill North. With determination, speed, toughness, swagger, and resolve to never back down from conflict or confrontation, Bill North forged an impressive 11-year Major League career with the Chicago Cubs, Oakland A's, Los Angeles Dodgers, and San Francisco Giants. Bill, that's a pretty good endorsement.
Tim's a good guy. I paid him a lot of money to write that.
Well, I doubt that. I doubt that. Well, Bill, today we're going to be getting your insights a lot on various sports issues, a lot of sports policy issues. I want to learn a little more about your career as well. But before we go forward, Bill, with some more topics, I understand, and I learned recently that Don Baylor, former Major League Baseball star, passed. I believe you and Don Baylor are pretty good friends, Bill. Can you share us with the listeners a little bit about Don Baylor?
Oh, yeah, Donnie came. We were in the league at the same time, and he was over there in Baltimore. And then he ended up coming to the Oakland A's, and he stayed with me for a while till he got his feet on the ground, but he was just a gentleman. Real intelligent man with many interests in that, but just I consider him a good friend, and when I saw him, I smiled. That's one of the best compliments I can give.
Just a great professional, Don Baylor.
Yeah, and a good guy.
Good guy, too.
Yeah.
He was a former Mariners hitting coach, too.
Yeah, he could hit. I don't know. He stayed in the league long enough, so he must have known something about it.
Bill, when you played in baseball in the 1970s era, that was an era of considerable social changes were going on in the country at that time. I'm going to ask you about several issues that were going on. One was the rise of players' rights, free agency. Players during that era had a lot of improvements in their working conditions. Can you share with us a little bit about what Marvin Miller did for the game of baseball, the labor organizer?
Well, I'll give you a personal example of what baseball was like. When I was playing for the Cubs in 72, they told me they wanted me to go to AAA to play because I skipped over AAA. And we got into a little conversation about that. And they eventually told me that you're either going to the minor leagues or you're going to be suspended for baseball for the rest of your life, and you're not going to be able to play with anybody. And that was called the reserve clause, which essentially meant that you belong to that club, and you, until they trade your rights or give your rights to somebody else, you had to do what they say. You had to go where they said to go. And if they made a trade, you had no say in it. And then a guy named Curt Flood came along, and he was traded from St. Louis to Philadelphia, and he didn't want to go. And that was really the big case, is because it went all the way to the Supreme Court, but he didn't win. But it brought a lot of notoriety And then Marvin Miller came along from the National Labor Relations Board to head the Players Association. He was the executive director of the Players Association. And he started talking about collective bargaining and restriction of a free market. And it was a kind of thing where he broke down through a series of events with Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith, Catfish Hunter and those, broke down the reserve clause. And we went on strike in 1972, the first strike ever in baseball. And
Miller was a labor organizer at that time, correct?
Yeah,
He was a players' union chief, right?
And it was the first strike, and we struck down the reserve clause. When we went on strike, I remember the night we had broke camp in Arizona and gone to New Orleans to play the White Sox, and we were supposed to play them 2 games. But after playing the first game that night at 12 o'clock, all of baseball went on strike. And the vote was 100%. There was no dissension.
Wow.
Dissenters. And pretty much whenever baseball had a work stoppage, it was 100%. Strongest union in America.
This is Paul Schneiderman on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio. I have as a special guest today former Major League Baseball star Bill North. Bill, is it your opinion that Marvin Miller helped revolutionize the game of baseball?
Yeah, because the owners had their narrative that was just simply not valid. And when they talked about their losing money and this and that, and all Marvin said, we'll open up your books. Let us see. To this day, the baseball owners have never opened up their books. But it's a kind of thing that you had a very exclusive club. But more than that, these guys were exempt from the Sherman antitrust laws. Sherman antitrust, yeah, because they conform to whenever there's an action. They don't. Congress tells them, don't bring it to me, because if I got to do this again, you might lose that exemption.
U.S. Supreme Court wrote in one opinion that baseball is a sport, not a business.
All right. Well, tell that to that guy making $30 million.
right.
And never missing a paycheck.
Bill, I want to ask you a little more about Curt Flood and Marvin Miller. Would the baseball establishment ever let Marvin Miller in the Hall of Fame? Posthumously,
I doubt it.
He's deceased now.
I doubt it. That's like letting Malcolm X in the Republican Party. You know what I'm saying? Marvin was a very, very contentious what do I want to say? Foe. Very contentious, learned foe to the establishments in baseball and the owners. And they didn't really like him at all because he changed everything. But he was proper, he was very well educated, but they didn't like him. And they still probably don't. They ought to get over it.
Bill, didn't Marvin Miller, Bill, before he died, state that he didn't care about being in the Baseball Hall of Fame anymore? Didn't he make comments to that effect?
I'm not quite sure he cared. If the Marvin I knew,
yeah.
I'm not quite sure he cared about it before that. You know, Marvin was a very self-contained man. He was in the Players Hall of Fame. And you know, these guys don't know Marvin Miller now, but you know what? He was like Michael Milken back in the days, and with Drexel Burnham Lambert, when they get all these MBAs and all they walked around and said, Michael. All we walked around and said, Marvin's coming.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
Of course, when Marvin came, he generally brought a check.
He was really revered in player circles, Miller, then?
Totally revered.
Right.
Totally.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Back to Curt Flood, Bill. Can you make a case that Curt Flood and Marvin Miller may have been as influential to the game of baseball, or even more so than Jackie Robinson? Could that argument be made about Curt Flood and Marvin Miller?
I don't. You're talking apples and oranges. Jackie set it up for all of us, for Curt Flood to be able to go there, and the establishment was in his act. I think Curt Flood and Marvin Miller were a offshoot or a follow-up to what Jackie established. I wouldn't get that. I'll tell you this, they got to be, all three of them got to be in the top 10.
Will Kurt Flood ever?
Jackie is number one.
Will Kurt Flood Bill ever be in the Baseball Hall of Fame?
No, I don't think he had the numbers to do it. But it broke his heart. And Kurt was a very, very sensitive man. I considered him a friend too. He was an artist. He did. He painted and he sculpted, and he was just a sensitive person. And they took his real love away from him, the game, and it broke his heart. And he moved out of the United States and moved to Spain.
I read a great biography on Flood a few years back.
Yeah, and he went over there and just kind of holed up and that, but he eventually came back. But you could still see pain in his eyes. And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, and he was a very gentle man. He was always kind to me, and I appreciate that. But they used him and abused him. And all he was sensitive and felt compelled to stand up and say, "Come on, man, why are you treating me like that?"
Real classy guy, then. Kurt Flood.
Real nice guy, real nice. Yeah, classy.
Bill, right now,
interesting man.
This is a subject that comes up, and you and I have talked about this subject off the air a little bit. We've talked about the labor relations subjects as well. But in the mid-'70s, I believe close to 33% or so of all baseball players in the major leagues were African American. Right now, I believe it's down to 8%. There's also a lack of African American managers and executives in Major League Baseball. I don't know if there's any black owners either. Bill, share with us what happened. What's happened to the decline of African Americans playing in Major League Baseball?
Well, it's a kind of thing that I feel that when they needed entertainment, and this was before ESPN and the TV contracts, and that they needed to put an entertaining team on the field, a team that could play. And African Americans, they played stickball. Were at the park. I was at the park all the time and all that kind of stuff. And then it got to be where money controlled it. And they found a different market. Not that they wanted to go and scout in the inner city anyway. And I'm going to tell you that it's quite a thing to realize what can happen if you got money in your pocket, and in America you don't have to use an African American. And it's quite, I think the proof is in the pudding. They built 20 academies in the Caribbean before they finished one in the inner city of L.A.
Are there any baseball academies right now in inner cities?
Yeah, there's a number of them, but it's the RBI program. There are a couple academies, but they could sign. Let's talk about the statistics. I remember it being 29.8% at one point. You might have different statistics. Now, Latin players are 27 or 28% because of the development of their abilities for a lot cheaper. They don't have to pay Latin players as much as they would pay an American. They can sign them at 16 and this and that.
This is Paul Schneiderman on Sports and Stuff. I have on as my special guest, Bill North. Bill, do you think that baseball is it heavily economic? Why they're spending more time in training academies in Latin America than many predominantly African American neighbors in the United States, or is there anything more to it as well?
Well, I would let you draw your own conclusions on that. Baseball has become an extremely expensive sport. There are no facilities in the inner city, where in the public schools, because of the fact they can barely buy books. and how can you build a good facility in the inner city? And so what happens is these kids in the suburbs have been raised playing together, and they've been developed together and they have these things in their suburbs called booster clubs. And their parents got money, and they build facilities and that. Now these guys have facilities, and when they play an inner city team and they beat them 18-2, ask me where is the joy for an inner city kid to play baseball
Bill,
when they're getting beat up like that?
Bill, what we hear sometimes is that in this era, a lot of African American kids may be more interested in other sports. Do you buy that at all?
No. I think that they've been outpriced, and they have it. I know in Seattle that I tried for 3 years to get Major League Baseball to build a facility right down 23rd.
Really?
It was 22nd in Massachusetts. They have some warehouses there, and they came to town, but they blew smoke for 3 years and didn't do anything. And what I was trying to get is, when they talked about the revival of baseball in the inner city, I was expressing that now you have a city in Seattle that kids in the suburbs get to go indoors and play baseball, and they enjoy that. So they develop year-round, as opposed to in the inner city, these kids have nowhere to go. And I was driving down the street one time up in Linwood, and it was drizzling, and they were out playing baseball. And I remember that vividly, because I used to do that.
Bill, we could talk so much more and I'm going to have you back sometime on a lot of these subjects. I want to move on to something else. The role of activism in sports. It seemed like during the 60s and 70s era, Muhammad Ali is one name. We heard a lot about athletes that were very outspoken in their position on various issues. The Kaepernick issue has come up recently. Is activism coming back a little bit more among professional athletes?
I don't know. I think that in this time of division in our country, there's a lot of people that have been developed their own enclaves to where they can be influenced and not have to go outside and see whether the influence is valid or not. And I think that this stuff in the world is people hold up in their suburbs and in their little towns, and they don't want to hear it. Of course, they don't have. It's not for me. It's my observation is that they don't have enough information to even comment on Colin Kaepernick, but they comment very vehemently and with hate and anger. And I don't think that this is an issue that you should have hate and anger. You should have discussion.
Bill, when you played in your career, did social and political subjects come up very much in the clubhouse? I know you mentioned labor issues, but were the ball players interested in these sorts of subjects?
Well, I think it changed because I was college educated and I was an activist, excuse me.
You went back and finished in 1992 at Central Washington, right?
93 I graduated.
Yeah.
And to make mama pay for my schooling. And the only time she ever missed a payment on the house was when she had to pay my tuition. And I figured that I should eventually finish.
You did. A lot of ball players don't have degrees, correct?
Yeah, well, I had enough credits, but not enough natural sciences. And so that's when I got into geology, which is one of my favorite things.
Great. Bill, any thoughts? Another issue that seems to come up in the sports world, it comes up a little more in the NFL these days, is this issue of domestic violence and sexual assault. And I read under the baseball current labor agreement, the commissioner has a lot of discretion and powers in deciding some of these issues when they come up. Any thoughts on whether baseball is doing enough to address domestic violence, and what do you think of the commissioner having powers to kind of be the sole decision maker on all these issues?
I think that's another subject that, and I'm not going to get into whether he has powers or not. I don't have very much tolerance for domestic violence. But that right there is being handled, I think, with fingers being stuck in the dike. And there needs to be more education and more I'm sure there's a way to handle this if you wanted to spend the time and the effort. But a lot of times it appears to be in an area where, or it might be publicized more in an area where you're using minorities and you're seeing minorities and you know, and I don't think that it's covered fairly, but I don't care what color you are. You don't need to be having violence. You don't need to.
Do you think the NFL has more of a problem with that issue in other sports?
I think that there's in my time there wasn't social media. I think people can tell on each other or want to, you know, or get exposed on what they're doing and inciting sometimes a mate to confront them and now you got caught dirty and here your only response is to
things are more transparent now, aren't they, Bill?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think I'd just now be getting out of San Quentin if they had those phones.
Bill, Bill,
just kidding.
Bill, I interesting when looking at your career that you never played for Seattle. Did you ever want to play for the Mariners in your career, Bill?
No. I got to come here for 1 year but I was a Californian boy. I left town.
You're a Garfield High School guy. Come on, Bill.
Know, but I love America, especially California.
This is Paul Schneider on Sports and Stuff with Bill North. Bill, something else that I've kind of learned talking to you and some other athletes, it seems, not all athletes, but it seems like some athletes, when they're done with their career, it could be after their college career, may have some challenges at times finding the next path of their careers. But you've been successful as a financial planner. Any thoughts on whether baseball could do more and other sports could do more helping players get integrated in new careers?
Well, I think that now the money has changed so drastically and it was quite challenging when I got out of baseball because I didn't have anywhere to go and it just developed, you know, and I was playing in an old timers game and Equitable was a sponsor in San Francisco and they asked me to come to work for them and that was in, I think, 84.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, and since that time I've been in financial services. Yeah.
Have you found most of the guys that you play with have most made a pretty good transition after baseball?
Very few have.
Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah. Do a lot of them rely on their baseball pensions heavily then? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it's, you know, it's hard to develop other venues when you're mentally inordinate being a professional athlete. You have to be, because it's that time, that OCD, when you were out there by yourself and the wars and the effect it has on you is tremendously overwhelming. And especially when you go away from it. It took me 3 years to admit I wasn't angry. And
you played 11 years. Most guys don't play anything close to that.
Well, I had to admit to myself what it was. And it was, I still, at my age, being out of the game this long, in January and February, I still have dreams about spring training and going to play.
You still do?
Yeah, that's how dominating the game is.
Wow, it's intoxicating, isn't it?
It's just permeating.
Bill, what would Commissioner Bill North do to change the game of baseball? This is probably going to be our last subject matter today. What would you do if you were the commissioner? What were some changes you'd implement or try?
I would seriously try and develop venues for kids that don't have privilege. For them to have some place to go, and with it, educate them and give them some joy, and make sure that they get to experience it too. And RBI is reviving baseball in the inner city. I know, to me, in Seattle, it could have done more, but it's just the kind of thing. To me, I have a project that I'm working on right now, and it's called Early Childhood Development and Childhood Adversity. And it has to do with the development of a brain of a child. And if they don't get fed and they don't bond within 2.5
Important work.
2.5 years, if their checkpoints aren't made in the first 2.5 years, they're destined to live a life like a lot of these kids in the inner city live today. I go to work on that immediately.
Important stuff. Bill, it's just been a pleasure having you on Sports and Stuff. I look forward to having you back, and this has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Praise God.